Thank you for tuning into Sydology 101. I'm your host, Sydney Robinson. We'll get into the challenges of the dental industry, empower leaders to inspire their teams, and foster collaboration between office team members and practice owners. Together, we'll find creative solutions to get shit done. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sydology 101. I am crazy excited about today's episode as I will be interviewing Emily Kircher-Morris. Emily is a mental health professional and advocate for neurodiversity. I know a lot of you have started to hear me talk about this a lot as I have, talked a lot about this journey of me trying to discover what type of person I am, understanding myself, how I communicate with my team members, and ultimately becoming a better leader, a better wife, a better mother. I have gone on this just personal journey, and neurodiversity has been something that has popped up a ton for me. And so I found Emily's podcast, and I thought that she would be a really great resource for some of you who are listening who want to improve their leadership skills. And improving leadership skills does not mean understanding, how to run a report. It doesn't just mean knowing what your practice numbers are. It means becoming someone who can communicate, relate, empower, influence team members. Well, one way of being able to do that is being able to understand the way that people work, the way their brain work, how they function. And then how can you communicate in a way that is receptive and more of a collaborative effort? And so I came across Emily's podcast. I found it super valuable, and I invited her to be a guest on today's show, and she agreed, which was crazy for me. And I found that with her in her field, she's deeply committed to creating this inclusive and supportive environment, whether it's in a classroom setting or it's in the workplace. She's a licensed professional counselor who has spent over a decade with neurodivergent individuals and specializing in providing therapy and resources that empowers her clients to thrive. Her passion for this field is deeply personal, as her herself navigated the educational system as a twice exceptional 2E student. So I hope that you all take a minute, listen to this episode. I know that it's talking more about mental health, autism, ADHD and dyslexia. Whether you don't have these things, it's a great listen just to try to get a deeper insight into the way that the brain works and other individuals. So I hope you guys enjoy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sydology 101. I am super giggity about this episode. A lot of you listeners, a lot of people that follow me who have come to our events, who have heard me lecture, knows my story somewhat of my journey for figuring out who I am, how I can become a better leader. And part of that has been me coming to terms that I have ADHD and I'm dyslexic. And so I am super excited because I have found someone who specializes and has a really huge podcast following and has done so much research on neurodiversity. And I can't wait to get into this with Emily and share some of the insight and how it affects the workplace. So thank you, Emily, for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we just had a huge OM workshop where we had a ton of people come out to San Diego. And in the workshop at the beginning, I actually opened up and just super vulnerable with everybody about me and some of the things that I learned about myself. And I shared with them how I am ADHD and dyslexic. And when I talked about neurodiversity in the workplace, eyes glazed over. They're like, what is that? Is that contagious? Kind of thing. And I thought this was like the perfect opportunity to be able to talk to our audience, to talk to other leaders who may have team members that have some form of neurodiversity. First thing first question I have for you, Emily, is what is neurodiversity?
Yeah, so Neurodiversity is interesting. It's an umbrella term. It's not a diagnostic term. It is a category that a lot of different labels or diagnoses or identifications fall underneath. And so it came out of the autistic community, but it has expanded beyond that. And really what it refers to are these labels or diagnoses that are related to how the brain is structured and wired as far as like throughout the lifespan. So we're talking about autism, we're talking about ADHD, we're talking about dyslexia or dysgraphia or dyscalculia, which are learning disabilities in reading, writing, or math. Things like epilepsy and Tourette's and bipolar also fall under that umbrella of neurodivergence. And it's interesting because when we talk about neurodiversity, like it's really just a comparison. You could think of it like biodiversity. So in any species, we have this variability. It is an asset to every species to have variability within how people or whatever that species might be have different traits that help them survive. And so neurodiversity is like that. It's like when we look at all of humanity, there's variability between individuals across the board. And so when we think about some of these specific labels for a really long time, they've been pathologized, they've been stigmatized, but ultimately we need people who look at problems differently, who solve problems differently. And yeah, we can think of it in this way to kind of just recognize what those traits are and find ways to create environments that are inclusive and accessible and allow those strengths to come to the surface. Depending on who you will ask, some people would categorize things like generalized anxiety or depression under that umbrella of neurodivergence. Personally, I take more of a conservative view of this. I tend not to so I'm a mental health clinician. And so the way I think about it is when I think about being neurodiversity affirming, I approach those things differently. So when somebody comes into my office because they are experiencing generalized anxiety or panic disorder or something like that, my goal is to make those symptoms of those things go away. I want them to not be experiencing those things anymore. When somebody comes into my office because they're autistic or they're ADHD, my goal is not to make the autism or the ADHD go away. It's to help them figure out how to navigate a world that wasn't necessarily created for them. And you can kind of get into some nuance about what labels are there, but essentially what we're talking about are the things that really impact how somebody communicates, how they learn, how they function, how they relate to other people. Those are the things that kind of fall under that umbrella of neurodivergence.
Can you share a little bit about your background and how you came to specialize in neurodiversity?
Yeah. So, I think a lot of these things always kind of start from when we're kids. So I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was a kid, when I was in fifth grade, which for women my age was pretty rare. That was not something that was happening a lot in the early 90s. But I knew that school specifically was very difficult for me. I had a really hard time with all of the things that school was asking me to do. So when I got into my career, I actually started my career in education because I wanted to help kids who had been like myself. And so I taught for over a decade in the schools. I have 2 masters. My second master's is in counseling. So I worked for a while as a school counselor, but then I transitioned into my practice as a mental health practitioner. But beyond that, though, I'm the host of the Neurodiversity podcast. I've written several books, which are more related to the education and parenting side of things, but I work quite frequently with workplaces and with adults as well who are neurodivergent. But ultimately, just kind of having that path and recognizing how much things have evolved over the last few decades, as how we understand neurodivergence, how we understand how these things manifest, and kind of being able to be an advocate and help people understand themselves has been really a great process. I'm also the parent to 3 kids who are also neurodivergent, so that kind of brings it all full circle in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I really love that at a really young age, you just said, okay, this is something that I struggle with. Help me understand. I want to learn as much as I can, but also I want to help others. It's really difficult. And I'm only going to speak for myself and maybe even a few people that I've come in contact with personally. A lot of people really don't understand ADHD or autism or dyslexia, bipolar, all those things that you just mentioned. A lot of people have not been diagnosed and they have no idea that they're struggling with this. I mean, we have work with so many dental professionals. I had a doc actually say, my hygienist, every time they go in and she puts in her perio chart, her numbers are always wrong. And she shared with me that I'm dyslexic. And he goes, how do we get, I don't understand. Should I fire her? And I clenched my pearls so hard. I was like, what? Why? How about let's try something different? What if she can
Hmm.
voice? What if she can go in and she can speak those numbers into it? And I found that he comes out and he says, this person actually wasn't diagnosed. She just thinks that she is. How can you optimize or maximize her strengths versus making her feel terrible? And I remember in school, I had to work 3 times as hard.
Hmm.
And I remember just one of those things that really gave me a really strong work ethic was I don't want to ever look like the dumb person in class. I was literally that kid that, okay, I don't know if they still do this in school, but where you have to read out loud and
Hmm.
then everybody get their section or their page. And I wouldn't pay attention to anyone else reading out loud. I would try to predict when it would be my turn. And then I would go in and I would read it. But what if someone read a little bit longer? What
Hmm.
if, hey, someone didn't go their turn or we're just going to skip? Then I was screwed from there because then I
Hmm.
would stumble over my words and those type of things. And it wasn't that I didn't understand it or couldn't read. It was just I read it differently. But the way that it was presented to me was you can't read, you're not as smart. And
Yeah.
I think that in the workplace as adults that we don't really recognize those signs. If we're starting to really understand this, how does neurodiversity show up in the workplace? And what are some signs or traits that leaders might overlook, in your opinion?
Yeah. So something that you mentioned just in your own story, your experience of trying to predict when you are going to have to read out loud because you're so
Mhm,
anxious about having to do it because you know that it is harder for you. That's a
mhm,
really common experience. So what you were doing in that situation is you were trying to mask. You were trying to camouflage those differences and so that people wouldn't notice those things. And that
right.
is something that you see quite often in the workplace where people really do try to hide these traits because let's
Mhm.
be really honest. Many of the traits that are associated with being neurodivergent are considered by society as like moral failings or character flaws.
Yeah.
You're not intelligent, you're too lazy, you're disorganized, you're selfish because you don't listen to what other people are saying or you react differently or you're rude, which because somebody just maybe speaks more directly. Like there are lots of things that most neurodivergent people have learned from a very young age are wrong or that
Mhm.
they should do differently. So they will try to do those things, but sometimes not always with really a good understanding of what's impacting them or how they can do things differently. So when you're in the workplace, you might really see some of these things coming to the surface. For example,
Mhm.
with autism, there are certain traits or characteristics that you might kind of notice and they might be subtle, but like you mentioned also, they might not be officially diagnosed.
Mhm.
So in the diagnostic criteria for autism specifically, we're looking at things like social communication differences. And so that might mean that somebody has a harder time reading between the lines and they really benefit from really giving very explicit instructions, very direct information.
Mhm.
The flip side of that is they may prefer very direct communication. So they may say something that's very direct, which comes across as rude when really it's not rude. It's just they're just
Right.
saying it. It could also be like differences in nonverbal communication. So one of the classic things that you hear people talk about is that sometimes autistic individuals struggle with eye contact. It's not as easy
Mhm.
for them to make eye contact. That's not all autistic people. There are some autistic people who that's not an issue for, but that's one. And so then there's this perception. So let's even think about a job interview process. You
Mhm.
might have somebody who is an excellent, say, dental hygienist or something like that who you
Yeah.
want to hire. But if you go into that interview and that person doesn't make eye contact with you and you're
Right.
you're the hiring manager or whatever, a lot of people rule that out. They say, oh,
Yeah.
that person doesn't have good social skills. They can't make eye contact. It's like their social skills might be fine. And again, what is the job that you're actually asking them to
Mhm.
do? And are they
Right.
able to do that? So those are some things. ADHD people, for example, a lot of times tend to bounce from topic to topic in conversation, have more lateral thinking. They might struggle just with executive functioning as far as, I mean, that could manifest as impulsiveness. It could manifest as difficulty with task persistence, like starting something and following it all the way through the steps. And with any of these things, though, with any of these things, the bottom line really is that we can provide tools and accommodations and supports that
Mhm.
bring those strengths to the surface and then also support those areas that are a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
And ultimately, these folks can be excellent employees and
Yeah.
do a great job. But again, they just maybe sometimes approach some of those things a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because you mentioned the covering things up in a workplace. I work with so many office managers. And because I used to do the same thing, and even that whole scenario that I gave in school, that went my entire life, all the way until I was open enough to say, all right, hey, this is me. This is enough. This is what I struggle with. And I'm so vulnerable with my team members. But I see a lot of office managers do this where maybe they don't want someone to know they made a mistake or they are talking to a team member. And for me, you nailed it. I am a very direct person. I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to read between the lines. I don't want to do any, just tell me what it is that you want me to know. Now, on a leadership standpoint, not everybody communicates that way. And I had to really learn, hey, you're rude. You're the problem, right? So if you want to talk to, yes, I want you to communicate with me directly, but vice versa. How do you like to be
Mm-hmm.
communicated with? I've added that now into my onboarding where because I scored, I don't know if you've ever heard this book, but it's called The Ideal Team Players by Patrick Lencioni. And he has this scorecard and essentially, these three virtues that he talks about in that book is humble, hungry, smart. But the smart part of it is not book smart. It's actually emotionally intelligence, being able to read a room. And as I start to find more things out about myself, that smart part, I scored so low, it was out of control. And so I was like, okay, if I score this low, it's because it's me, it's not them. So how can I try to understand people? And I love the dental hygienist part that you gave. Just because you don't make eye contact in your interview doesn't mean that you're not going to be a rock star hygienist.
Mm-hmm.
This person may be able to talk to patients because that's where they're passionate at, that's what they're
Mm-hmm.
good at. And just because they weren't able to have that conversation with you does not mean that's not going to relate over to the patients.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we do want to have a good bedside manner. We want to make sure, that there is some type of personality there. And I do think, yes, we want to look at that, but I think that there's so many ways that you can help. So what if your hygienist doesn't make eye contact, but they're awesome hygienists? They are awesome organizers. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
I like things to be organized. What if you can take that hygienist and they are now in charge of all of the ordering,
Mm-hmm.
supplies, making sure equipment, that's the things that's going to get them super giggity and keep them happy within their position.
Yeah, yeah. One of the biggest things is specifically kind of related to that, actually. You mentioned they
Hmm.
might be really organized, and that can often be a trait for a lot of autistic individuals. But one of the biggest barriers that often happens, especially for
Mhm.
autistic individuals, is when there are unexpected changes. So
Oh man,
sometimes
yes.
autistic individuals will have a really hard time adapting and being flexible if they don't have advance notice about things. And
Right.
so, how does that manifest in the workplace setting? It might be like they get really irritable when something
Mm.
happens, not according to how it usually does. But
Right.
those are easy things to adapt to. But we have to have an environment where these are conversations that we're having. And
Right.
again, it's not really necessarily directly related to a label. There are a lot of people who get
Hmm.
anxious when there are unexpected changes.
Yes,
And so, how
absolutely.
do we help create an environment where communication is open, that people aren't feeling like they're trying to hide these things,
Mm.
and that we can develop plans that work for everybody? I don't know a single person who doesn't benefit from having advance notice about things, but trying to have, even if it's just a plan in place for if this, then that. But
Yeah.
being, again, going back to that explicit information and being really direct
Yep.
about it can be really useful for people.
Yeah, I love that you said that. You'll be so surprised in a dental practice how you have your practice leaders, and I'm calling us out. Oh, I went to this conference and there's this really cool technology. I just signed up and I'm going to switch us over. And for
Uh
those
huh.
people, I'm like, whoa, what do you mean you just switched us over? It took me a year to learn this. Yeah, so
Totally.
it's a huge shock. So I want to actually pivot because that's a really good segue into what are some hidden superpowers that a neurodivergent individual often bring to a team?
Yeah. Yeah. It really is about problem solving and communication and
Hmm.
being able to adapt in different ways. For example, one common trait of autistic individuals is that they have these monotropic interests, which is like a fancy word for saying those very intense special interests.
Yeah.
And you'd be surprised the number of professionals who are like so engaged in what they're doing and they have this really deep knowledge of it. And so they go into that profession, but that is often one of their strengths that we can really build on. A lot of times, also, again, we have that comfort with consistency. So those are the people maybe who you rely on to develop the procedures, to develop the routines, to
Yeah.
create those standard operating procedures documents about how we do things in certain ways, like
Hmm.
building on those particular strengths. Sometimes, if you're trying to figure out ways to solve a problem, a lot of ADHDers are really great. There's research that shows that ADHDers tend to be more creative. They have
Hmm.
more of that lateral thinking where they can kind of make these intuitive jumps from one thing to another. That
Right.
is not always the way that a lot of people solve problems, but they might come up with an idea that could be really unique that you hadn't considered before.
Yep.
Trying to come up with all of those different pieces. Sometimes things that are strengths actually come out of the areas of difficulty. For example, like with dyslexia, sometimes people who are dyslexic and also ADHD tend to actually develop strategies that are related to just attention to detail because they've had these experiences in the past where they have made some of those mistakes. And so they're kind of very aware of that. So then they
Hmm.
have strategies and skills that they've put into place as a backstop to make sure that they don't do those. But again, you can
Right.
pull those to the surface as well. So
Right.
there's just, I mean, there's a lot of different things. And I think more than anything, having people who have that diverse mindset, it doesn't do a team a whole lot of good to have a bunch of people who all think the same way.
Oh, goodness. Yes,
And
absolutely.
so you want to invite that in. You want to get feedback from people to see how you can create systems and processes that work for everybody, that really are inclusive. And we talk a lot about, when we talk about neurodivergence, about like accommodations. How do we make accommodations that allow people to be successful based on
Mhm.
what their strengths really are?
Yeah, I love that. And something, and I don't know how true this is, but I would be curious. You mentioned like something that someone's super excited about. Somehow I found my groove, and what just gets my jellies going is system and operating procedures. I am obsessed. I will find something, whether it's a software, whether it's a document, whether it's an idea or something that's creative, like you mentioned, and I would get obsessed about it, where it's to a point that I know there's an answer to it. I just need to figure out what that answer is. But I find that I do things a bit backwards. I like to work through the problem. So if I know what the goal is supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
I like to work backwards to get to like how, instead of saying how do we start, I'm like, okay, if we want to, I guess, implement a new software, what problem will this software solve, right? And then now, okay, if I could solve that problem, how does this software solve this problem? And then how we get there. I find that I do that backwards, but I also bump heads with our COO because she's no, we have to start here.
Yeah. Huh?
You got to start at A. You can't start at Z, Sydney. And I'm
Yeah.
like, no, you can,
Mm-hmm.
because you actually may find something in the middle that you didn't know, or you may go from A to C, but then figure out, wait, if once we get to try to get to Z, we're at a roadblock. And I
Mm-hmm.
find that I actually work a little bit more efficiently that way. So I would be curious to know, hearing that from me, is that something typical that you do see?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that's a great example of what we would call the difference between a big picture thinker, somebody who
Yeah.
sees the big picture, who then can kind of put the pieces together, to somebody who is more of a logical sequential thinker, like A, B, C, D, E. We need both of those people. But the problem is that for a lot of, I'm going to make a generalization here, but this is, of
Yep.
course, not all. But a
Yeah.
lot of ADHDers tend to be that big picture thinker, but they get lost in the details sometimes. And other people, like if we're just looking at neurodivergent types, you have of people, a lot of autistic individuals tend to be more of that very logical, sequential, step by step. Of
Hmm.
course, anybody who doesn't have a diagnosis can fall into either one of those categories as well, but just
Yeah.
recognizing those different types of problem solving. But we need both of those. So it's funny, in my most recent book that I wrote, I had a co-author, And she and I kind of have a similar kind of difference there as you do with your COO, where I'm much more of the big picture. And I
Yeah.
love that new process and getting things started. I get really
Yep.
excited about it. That novelty really kicks in my interest. And
Yeah.
so I'll get going on things. But then she is very able to break things down into the steps, really
Hmm.
specifically look at everything and kind of walk through. And that blend there is really great when we can work together
Yeah.
as a team. But sometimes though, especially when you're dealing with a big shift or a big change, you
Mhm.
have to have that big picture vision in
Right.
order to be able to see where you're going. But sometimes again, for some people though, if you are a visionary, if you're the person who's in charge and you
Hmm.
are trying to get your team to come along with you on things, you may have people on your team who really are
Hmm.
much more logical and sequential. And if you don't lay things out for them, they're going to feel really overwhelmed and lost.
Right.
And on the flip side, if it's reversed and you have people on your team who are more those big picture folks and all you're doing is giving them just do this thing next and they're like, why, where are we going with
Right.
this, what's the point? Like you
Yeah.
have to blend that and recognize that people see those things in different
Hmm.
ways.
Absolutely. I realized that really early on once I became a leader. And like I said, her and I butt heads. And it was to a point where I came out and I actually said, I'm dyslexic. And then she goes, light bulb. Oh, wait a
Mm-hmm.
minute. Now it makes sense. And I was afraid to actually say it. I was afraid of being judged. One of my fears is fear of failure, because
Mm-hmm.
as you can only imagine, growing up in an environment where you're told that you're not doing things right, I don't ever want to be seen as lazy. I don't want to ever be seen like I'm not going to do twice as hard. And to come out to my bosses and say this at that time was really difficult for me. What I now want to pivot to is really that strength in leadership. So, how can a leader better recognize the strengths of their neurodivergent team member, especially if those strengths don't fit the standard mold?
Yeah. So, one thing I think is about opening lines of communication. So, I actually
Mhm.
even have a document I'll share with you, and you're welcome to throw it in the show notes or whatever. But it's basically a document that I've used when I've worked with different businesses, and it's like kind of a getting to know my work style type of document. Again, it's good for everybody, neurodivergent or not, but it looks at things like what are the best ways to give feedback? What are the best ways, like as far as communicating that works for you? When do you do your best work? What type of environment works best for you? Are there certain accommodations that can be used depending on the size of your team? Everybody can fill this out, but then you would then have a document that you've then shared with your employees or your team, and you can just make them feel comfortable
Yeah.
identifying the fact that they have unique needs and unique skills that can all be that we can try to meet those. Are we going to be
Yeah.
able to modify every single thing, every single process? No. But if we know how somebody communicates or we know how they best learn, then we
Mhm.
can adapt those pieces so that then they fit within our system that we have in place.
Yeah.
And finding those ways to do that. I mean, I just think communication is a really big piece of that and normalizing the fact that it's okay to adapt. It's okay to ask for supports or advocate if necessary. And the other thing, just specifically about having neurodivergent employees on your team, is the fact that people will sometimes say things like, they just need to self advocate. They just need to come and tell me what they need. If we are in the position of power, if we are the people who are the team leads, the employers,
Yeah.
whatever it is, we
Yep.
have to make sure that we are opening that door for advocacy because
Absolutely.
it is so difficult to do that for anybody. And
Mhm.
so we can't always put all of that pressure on that person who needs the help or who needs to advocate. We need to make sure that we're giving them opportunities to do that, making them feel welcome, making them feel heard. And I think that those are really some of the foundational pieces for leaders to take some steps to implement.
Yeah, I actually so happy that you said that, because as you were talking, I realized that once I came out and actually said these things, and I eventually came out and said this to our team members, and then we started to put these things in place where I just want to make sure that we're focused on this. I had some team members that went online and they found like this free assessment. And they was like, you know what? I think there's something going on with me. I've had some team members that, hey, I have an appointment. I want to, this is starting to make a lot of sense now that we're learning more about this. And I felt so inspired that felt open enough to talk to me about it. And it wasn't every single team member, but I had some people like reach out to me privately and say, "Hey, this is what I discovered about myself." And I just can't believe that you coming out and saying this. It just took someone actually to be vulnerable and for you to be our boss. Thank you for sharing those things with us. And I feel like it just not only did it just helped us on a more, I guess, cultural, emotional level where my
Hmm.
team members, yes, am I the boss? Am I'm the owner of the company? Absolutely. However, they feel so comfortable coming to me and talking to me. I have one gal that was like, Sydney, I struggle with getting here on time because of this. And so we just put some things in place. Hey, when I come in, I notice that I'm super frustrated when I come in. Okay, what do you do when on your drive into work? What do you listen to? And then we just made those small tweaks because,
Hmm.
again, it's just little things that we could do that we can control that's going to help us have a good day. And
Yeah.
so I love that you shared that part of having that open door where people feel safe, they feel
Hmm.
comfortable. And if it starts with, to me, it personally starts with being vulnerable enough, being
Hmm.
vulnerable to say, and maybe you don't have anything. Maybe you
Yeah.
are
No.
completely fine. But I think that vulnerability can still be there where maybe you know somebody. This isn't just a isolated thing. There's so many people that may have ADHD or any of
Hmm.
those things. Hey, my son has it, or I
Hmm.
have an uncle that has it, or I used to work with someone. And here's some things that I learned. Like, you don't have to just say that because I don't have this problem, that's not my problem.
Yeah.
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 So I love that you said that.
No, I think you're right. And I think also just recognizing that there are many people out there who have a lot of these traits who maybe are like subdiagnostic. So like I always mention this. I mentioned I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was a kid. I know that I have a lot of those autistic traits. I know that
Mhm.
now as an adult, I would never meet diagnostic criteria, but I was also diagnosed with ADHD before Asperger's was even added to the DSM, which of course we don't use that label now. And so I've never been assessed for that, but I always think that as a kid, that would be it would have been interesting to look at it when I
Yeah.
was struggling the most.
Yeah.
But the point that I'm making though is that you will have people who are neurodivergent who don't know it. You will
Hmm.
have people who start working for you and then their kids get diagnosed and then they come to a diagnosis. But you
Hmm.
also just have, again, variability with all of all of the people on your team
Yeah.
who there are going to be people who, again, what does anxiety look like? What does social anxiety look like? What is all of these different things that can influence how somebody shows up in the workspace, and
Yeah.
trying to figure out specifically how do we make an inclusive environment that
Hmm.
allows for those differences to be nurtured and supported so that everybody can reach their potential, feel satisfied in the workplace.
Right.
And so it really does go beyond this. When I do a lot of work, I mentioned, with schools specifically. And when I talk to
Hmm.
educators, we'll talk about making accommodations in the classroom. And what I always say is like a neurodiversity affirming classroom is not just good for neurodivergent students, it's good for all
Hmm.
students. Same goes for the workplace. A neurodiversity affirming workplace is not just good for the neurodivergent employees, it's good for everybody.
Everybody, yeah. And just to have a clarity and understanding, because you may
Mm-hmm.
also have team members that have no idea. Just
Yeah.
everybody have their own thing. We obviously want to respect personal boundaries and things like that. I would never come out and say some of those things that people have shared with me, but you can create that culture where you guys are open to share things. One of the things that we do in our morning huddle when we do our morning meeting is what's something positive that happened or what is something that you're working on. And everybody shares something. It's not professional. They share one thing. One guy wants to lose body fat and build muscle, that
Mm-hmm.
type of thing. And it's just having that open. And then I realized that people actually have started shifting and they're like, you know what? I've actually been meditating. And I find that I listened to this podcast and it's really helped me. Like things aren't always just like physical or health wise. Some of it is just like personal wise.
Mm-hmm.
Or I finally got to a point where I'm not stressed out about my finances, someone else had shared. And I was like, heck yeah, that's really great. But that's because we started to open up that floor where people can
Yeah.
start to talk to each other. And then I started to hear other team members share personal things with each other
Mm-hmm.
because they can now relate. And it is a beautiful thing. It's a
Hmm.
beautiful thing to witness as a leader to say, you know what, we are working, what is it? They say we're with our work family 80% more than what we were with our actual families because we are spending more time with them. With that being said, being able to have these personal connections to have that workplace support is super huge.
Hmm. Totally.
So, as we come to a close here, what are some helpful resources that you would recommend to even someone like me who is still learning more about herself and want to also move this into the workplace where I could start to help support my team members?
Okay. So, a couple of things that I would recommend. So, definitely check out the Neurodiversity podcast. Although we do a lot of episodes related to parenting and educating, there are a lot of episodes that are related just to neurodivergence in general, and especially throughout the lifespan and for adults. We have a lot of episodes of people kind of sharing their stories as well. So, that can always be a helpful tool. There's another book called The Neurodiversity Edge by Maureen Dunn. That's a great book that you can look into. And there are lots of different resources available out there about understanding each of these. A friend of mine, Ari Tuckman, has a new book that's coming out on ADHD specifically within the next couple of months. And I think it's coming out in April or maybe very early May. But that would be a great resource as well. But there are lots of tools. But more than anything, if you're really curious about this, and if you're on like LinkedIn, there are a lot of great voices out there who are just sharing content there about their experiences, about strategies. And so you can find those tools and ideas in lots of different places.
Awesome. Those are some really great ones. I know, like I said, my journey of trying to learn more about myself, I came across your podcast. I do know that you have several books, and I believe I've heard of the one that you just said,
Maureen,
Maureen
yeah,
Dunn.
yeah.
I think she was on I think that was the very first episode, and it was with, it's like Krista and her husband. They were actors, and I don't know if they still act or not.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah, yeah,
anyway,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I
It
think
was
that's
on Armchair Expert with Kristen.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. I think that was the very first episode that I actually was introduced, and then I went down this rabbit hole
Yeah,
of just some really great things. So that's pretty awesome. I really like that. I would have to check the book out too.
yeah, definitely.
The final thing that I always like to ask in this podcast is because it's about work-life balance.
Hmm.
And I know this is more of a different episode, but I still always like to ask our guests, with all the things that you have going, understanding mental health is super important. We have a lot of work professionals, and sometimes we get caught up in our work lives where we don't have that balance. What advice would you give someone to having and maintaining a healthy work-life balance?
I think more than anything, it is really about taking time to check in with yourself and really evaluating what's working and what's not, and adjusting your systems or your balance as far as kind of how you're allocating your time, how you're allocating the responsibilities. So now my schedule is very flexible. I make my own calendar, but I know something for me that is really helpful is on Mondays, I try not to book anything in the morning till about 1 p.m. when I start seeing clients, because that gives me that time to kind of ease into the week and kind of organize everything. My brain really needs that opportunity. I notice that if I don't have, that's when my stress level starts to rise. And so I'm always kind of trying to play catch up with that. So that was something that I implemented just based on kind of my own experiences. Like I
Mm,
said, I recognize that not everybody has that type of flexibility, but my point really is to
yeah.
pay attention to what are the points that feel like they're where you get into a flow space and things are feeling
Mhm.
good. What are the points that are feeling like the stress? And
Mhm.
as that stress begins to mount, one of the biggest signs of burnout is like a feeling of ineffectiveness or a
Mhm.
feeling of just overwhelm or just not caring anymore. If you
Yeah.
start to see that in yourself, it's really time to back away for a minute and try to observe and see what's going on and what you can shift,
Mhm.
because burnout is real and a lot of us push through so much, and it you get more back by backing off and taking the time to recalibrate than trying to push through, because it just then
Yep.
takes even longer to come back
Yep.
from that. That's my thought, seeing where you can make those little tweaks if possible. And it's slow and it's ongoing. It's never like you're going to find the magic thing and it's just going to be fixed forever.
Yeah, because I sometimes feel, okay, I found my groove. One of the biggest things that I do is I turn my do not disturb on. So as soon as at 5 o'clock, it's on. I'm
Mhm.
not working on anything else. I even start to close my laptop. I read a book. I really start to do something that just takes my mind off of it where now I'm at home. I we work in a field where burnout is huge. And I have a lot of office managers or practice leaders that is just if a patient calls at 7 p.m., I got to answer that phone call, or a person just called out sick. And so now I got to figure this out. And my whole thing is, are we running into a burning building right now?
Yeah.
Are we saving lives right now? That is a no for me. Is that something that's we can wait on?
Yep.
Is that something that is cutting into that time? Every once in a while, absolutely. Yes, I understand that may happen. But if this is happening every day, every week, then there's a problem, and we just need to get to the root of that problem.
Yeah.
So I love that you said that.
Yeah, I think you're right though. Looking beneath that to figure out what is really happening there to solve that problem, as opposed to constantly trying to triage these things that maybe don't need to be quite as urgent, but add a significant amount of stress to our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Emily, this has been so helpful. Words can't express at how thankful I am that you are on this episode with me. I know that this is really new for me. This is a new journey for me. And to have someone like you in your area of expertise to be able to give other people helpful tips and tricks and to look inward has been just amazing. So thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of Sydology 101. There are going to be some helpful resources that will be listed in the show notes, so make sure that you take advantage and take a look at those. I also want to let all of our members know, for Front Office Academy members, remember that you have access to Talkspace. So we want to make sure that you're utilizing that resource. If you logged in and you took a listen to this episode and any of this related to you, there's so many helpful resources that is listed. So make sure that you guys reach out to us. If you have no idea where to go and find that, you can visit us at frontofficeacademy.com and then fill out a contact us form. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time. This has been another episode of Sydology 101. Today's episode was sponsored by FOA Coaching. If you would like to find out more about team training or personalized coaching, visit foacoaching.com. Also, make sure to follow us on Instagram at Sydology 101. Until next time, friends.